We are determined to do a full overhaul in the name of equity and in the name of justice.
There could be a day when we don't need police, but that day isn't today.
No, not rigged! Do not rigged! Hold up!
While the majority of Austin voters, supported police reform, they didn't support, cutting cops.
I think what is of utmost concern right now to our community is making sure that we are, as a police department, are keeping people safe.
But if we're going to have policing, we need to have policing be as fair and as equal as it can possibly be.
Thank you for joining us for our Town Hall Forum as part of our special presentation, Reforming the Force. We're diving into Austin's attempts to redefine public safety while dealing with staffing shortages and rising rates of murders and gun violence. Joining us tonight is our panel of public safety experts. Joe Chacon, the man appointed Austin's new police chief. Dr. Peniel Joseph, an expert in race's role in democracy with UT Austin's LBJ School of Public Affairs. And Margo Frasier. She's a former Travis County Sheriff, former Austin Police Monitor, and current Vice President of the National Association for Civilian Oversight in Law Enforcement. Before we get to tonight's questions, this is not meant to be a debate about Proposition A. That item will be on the November ballot, and it would set certain staffing and training standards for the Austin Police Department. As we get closer to Election Day, we will dive into Proposition A a lot more. But for the purposes of this forum, we're focusing on APD and where it is right now and the idea of reform, regardless of the outcome of November's election. This will be a conversation between our three panelists, so let's get to our first question of the night. We want to start with one that we got from a KVUE viewer. His name is James Villegas. He asked, quote, how can defunding the police in Austin be called a success when we have a historic murder rate and record low number of police officers on the street? So there are really two parts to this question here. Chief Chacon, we want to start with you first. Whether you call it defunding or reimagining, did these changes directly correlate to staffing issues and higher violent crime rates in our city, Chief?
Well, thank you, Tony, and thank you for putting together this forum for our community. I think it's so incredibly important. Really the issues of defunding, if it's going to be referred to as defunding or reimagination, are complex issues. And I think that what the city is trying to do right now, and certainly the police department is trying to figure out the right way forward on what reimagination really means. I've stated many times, one of the most important things that we do as a police department is keeping people safe. But we have put some measures in place that have been, somewhat successful in taking illegally owned firearms off the street and trying to curb gun violence. And we have restarted our police academy and have 2 academies scheduled in this fiscal year, which are going to help turn around those record low number of police officers.
Dr. Joseph, I want to go to you now. Whether or not you call it defunding or reimagining of the Austin Police Department, do you consider what has happened here over the past year especially a success, and why or why not?
Well, I would consider the conversation to be the beginning of the beginning. And when we think about even the terms we use, defund the police tells a narrative, it says a story. It upsets some people, but we have to remember that abolishing slavery upset people in the 19th century too. So when people are being oppressed, if they say abolish slavery, voting rights, or defund the police, there's going to be a reaction. So we have to remember that. This past year, there's been some reallocation, but remember, defunding the police or reimagining public safety, it's really an argument that says what the police have been used for, both in Austin and nationally, is a gateway to panoramic systems of racial and economic gender oppression.
Dr. Joseph, thank you. And you mentioned a lot of the root causes for what we have seen in terms of violence, and I want to talk to you about that a little later as well. But Margo, I want to go to you now, just as someone who who does not work as a public official now, but has certainly been on the front lines of this conversation, not only in Austin, but nationally. What are your thoughts on what has happened in Austin over the past year?
I think a lot of focus has been on the murder rate, particularly because it's historic high. But what I think people need to realize is that has been a trend nationally. I was excited to hear that Austin was talking about, reimagining or really looking at how we provide law enforcement services in this community. But in the same way, I was a little bit disappointed in the fact that I think that what we wound up having was a lot of one-way communications that people weren't, where they were kind of talking at each other instead of to each other. And so we wound up with some unintended consequences, such as a lot of officers feeling as if they were under attack and leaving the force.
So I know all three of you, of course, live in Austin and work in Austin, but certainly are part of the national conversation of police reform as well. One of the things that Austin city leaders hoped when they made some of the policy decisions that they did last year is that Austin and APD would sort of be a national model for how to reimagine public safety. So I want to ask all three of you, what do you think other cities have learned and can learn from Austin's attempts to reform APD? Chief Chacon, over to you first.
Thank you, Tony. I think that, what other cities might take away and what we ourselves continue to learn from the process is that this is not something that we have a blueprint for, that there's a clear roadmap on how to accomplish what we're trying to do. And so we have to be very critical, learn from our own mistakes, document those, and also learn from our successes. Have we gotten it right every single time? I don't think that we have, but I think that we're certainly trying to figure our way through this and see how we can best come up with a model that is going to deliver police services in the way that our community desires and still keep the public safe.
And Margo, from where you sit, do you believe that Austin is creating or has created a model for police reform?
I don't know that we're the model yet. I mean, I think that Austin has taken some bold steps, but I agree with the chief that part of it is you have to learn from your mistakes. Often what happens in Austin, no matter what the issue, is that the loudest tend to be heard, as opposed to recognizing that there are other aspects and segments of the community that need to be involved in the conversation. And so I have faith. I mean, I think probably every one of the Austin city leaders, I have faith that they can kind of adapt what they're doing and make sure that it is more inclusive. But I think it could certainly benefit from being more inclusive of all the different segments of our community.
Dr. Joseph, much of your study has focused on race relations and civil rights, and many of the changes we've seen in Austin were, of course, in reaction to last year's unrest and the push nationwide for social change. What do you think other cities have learned from Austin's attempts at police reform?
Well, I think they've learned how just difficult it is. I think one of the things we're seeing is that, look, the most important stakeholders here are the black and brown and white and Asian people who've been killed by APD and other police departments and their families. Those are the most important stakeholders. The most important stakeholders are those who are mentally ill, who've been brutalized, people who are homeless or housing insecure, who've been mistreated. The people who were protesting peacefully last summer who lost eyes to APD rubber bullets. Those are the stakeholders if we believe in American democracy and if we believe in human rights for all people. So APD and the money we spent on APD has made maybe some people safer, but has it made the entire community safer? What we should be trying to do here in the city of Austin is build a beloved community that is free of racial injustice, free of economic inequality, and free of any kind of systemic oppression or structural violence against any community. And that's what last year was all about.
So we're going to pause there for a quick commercial break. When we come back, we're digging into the issues of police staffing and rising crime rates nationwide. You're watching a KVUE News Defenders Austin American-Statesman special presentation, Reforming the Force. Welcome back to our Reforming the Force Town Hall Forum. We're back with our panelists, Austin Police Chief Joe Chacon, Dr. Peniel Joseph with the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and former Travis County Sheriff and Austin Police Monitor, Margo Frasier. So let's jump right back in. We know there have been a lot of retirements and resignations among APD's sworn staff in the past year or so. We got this question from quite a few viewers. It was phrased in different ways. We'll ask it this way. Has Austin's effort to reimagine public safety driven good officers away? What can the city do to retain staff? Chief Chacon, your thoughts on this question?
You know, it's a great question and one that we continue to look at. We've had many officers that are eligible to retire decide to go ahead and take that option, and then many officers who have decided to resign right now. I think that the reimagination and really the overall national narrative around policing right now has made the policing profession really, really hard right now. And that is not lost on our officers. How we turn that around, I think, is by our community really coming together to show their support for the police and show that how valued they are, because I truly believe that we have an incredible police department of men and women that are here to serve, that go out and do their jobs very well every single day. And when they do fall short, we as a police department have held ourselves accountable.
Margo, in your estimation, what can and should the city do to keep good officers on the force?
A lot of the deputies and officers that I know were very frustrated when they felt like they were being painted with the same brush as, officers like in Minnesota. We have to talk in terms of the fact that we value our officers, but that we demand a lot of them as far as the way in which they interact with people, and we provide them the training to do so.
Dr. Joseph, we know that APD changed its police academy to style it more like a college classroom and less like a military boot camp. I want to ask you, what are some of the things that rookie APD officers who will hit the streets next year can do to mend broken relationships with the community?
Well, I think it's bigger than just sort of the rookie. I think it's the system. I think APD was right to have, it was a forced pause on the cadet class as part of this reimagining public safety. The only way we can transform public safety in Austin is from root to stem, and that's what the reimagining public safety task force has done. From root to stem, it's come up with specific policy proposals that involve a reallocation of APD's budget in perpetuity, right? So they're saying forever. Certain things will not be the prerogative of APD. So alongside of that, you're getting investments in some of the poorest neighborhoods in Austin. Because again, the poorest neighborhoods in Austin, the difference between those neighborhoods and the neighborhood I live in, it's not that somehow we're such better people in this neighborhood. We've been cared for. We have resources. We have education, right? But there are other parts of the city that the city has not shown love, that is not part of our potential beloved community. And what APD stands for them is an occupying army rather than a shining sentries for justice and for peace, right? So we can transform policing in Austin, but the only way we can transform policing in Austin is to admit that we have a systemic problem. It's not about a few bad apples. And the way in which rookies could impact that is the way in which they would treat citizens here in Austin, and just people, whether they're documented or not, as human beings, and not to think of every single person that they encounter as a criminal and not to criminalize them.
And Chief, I wanted to ask you that as well. What will be your expectation for these new rookies when they hit the streets in the next coming months?
So Tony, you know, when we began our most recent academy class, the first 2 weeks was a program called Community Connect, where our brand new cadets went out and they met with the members of our community, different stakeholders. We are grounding our training based in service. You know, I'm sorry that there still are people, you know, who feel that we are an occupying force and an occupying army. That is certainly not my intent as the chief of police. It will not be the way that, you know, the Austin Police Department, from my expectation, is going to deliver services. We are here to serve. And I think that our officers go out and just do an incredible job of treating people with respect and you know, providing that service in a moment of crisis for people when they call 911. I know that is you know, the overwhelming outcome of our calls, and on those calls where we have tragic outcomes or even bad outcomes, we will critically look at those and make adjustments to make sure that you know, we try and keep those from ever happening again.
Chief, thank you so much. We want to pause for another short commercial break, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion about staffing and talk about what to expect in the future. You're watching a KVUE News Defender's Austin American-Statesman special presentation, Reforming the Force. Welcome back to our special town hall forum, Reforming the Force. We're back with Austin Police Chief Joe Chacon, former Travis County Sheriff and Austin Police Monitor Margo Frasier, and Dr. Peniel Joseph with the LBJ School of Public Affairs. The Austin Police Department's budget is now back at 2019 levels as of October 1st. Chief Chacon, I want to start with you with this question. What could change as part of the new budget? Will APD simply go back to the way things were in 2019?
You know, we're always going to be looking critically at our funding levels. I think it's important that a police department be well funded, that we have the appropriate number of police officers that are necessary to answer those priority urgent calls. When people call 911, they need officers there and they want them very quickly. And I think that that is the expectation of our community. So that being a kind of driving element in how funding levels are determined, it, you know, has to be made at that city level. But I'll tell you right now, my priority is bringing people onto the department. Our staffing levels are low and need to be brought back up. Our priority call response times are lower or taking longer, and that is of great concern to me right now. And so I think, you know, it's going to be kind of a multi-pronged effort that is going to take some time to really work through.
Margo, what changes would you like to see APD keep as part of the reimagining efforts, particularly as this new year's budget takes effect?
You know, I must tell you, the changes at the Academy are some of the most positive changes that I've seen in as far as long as I can remember. I agree with the chief that, you know, that the public, the number one thing they want out of the police department is to not only be safe, but to feel safe. And so that requires that when somebody calls 911, that they get an appropriate response. That's not always a police officer, and sometimes that looks different. You know, I think back, I'm going to age myself here, but, you know, you go back 25 years ago when, you know, I was sheriff and introduced the idea of having people that were victim services advocates to show up at domestic violence calls. People thought that was crazy. It not only, again, frees up officers, but it also makes it safer for the officers, for the persons that they're interacting with, and provides a better quality of service.
Dr. Joseph, we're running out of time here, but I do want to close this question with your thoughts. What changes would you like to see APD keep as part of the reimagining efforts, particularly, again, as this year's budget goes into effect?
Well, I think it's really more about what changes were proposed by the Reimagining Task Force, and that has to do with rediverting the priorities that the police have, rediverting. There were different proposals in there, including stopping the use of police dogs, which disproportionately bite Black and Hispanic men, police horses, switching lake patrol to EMS, stop officers' self-initiated calls, completely revamp the curriculum of the academy beyond what already has been done. So there's so much that needs to be done. So instead of having police that stand as sentries between segregated neighborhoods and segregated communities in Austin, we would have public safety, which is a concern to all of us who are citizens, who are parents, who are undocumented, be the priority. And from that perspective, the reallocation wouldn't be seen as a threat, right? Because the police are there to serve us. We are the stakeholders of the police. So if we say we're going to use this money to help other parts of the community while still having a police force, it doesn't mean that we're anti-police. It means that we're for transforming public safety so it can be part of building a beloved community here in Austin.
Dr. Joseph, thank you. Chief Chacon, one last thing as we close out our conversation here. Several groups, including the Austin NAACP and the police union, issued statements opposing your hiring as the new police chief. So we want to give you a chance to have some final thoughts on not only that opposition, but also to talk about your goals for your first 6 months as police chief and what metrics you are going to be setting for yourself and the department to accomplish those goals.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks for giving me an opportunity to address this. This is really, as we've gone through the whole reimagination process and, the transition to a new police chief, I know that our community, if they think that major change is needed or is desired, that how are you going to accomplish that with somebody from the inside? And I can tell you that just looking back on my career, specifically what I've done over the last several years, and then in my time as an interim chief, is that I have been moving us in that direction of change. I feel confident that I'm going to be able to win the hearts and minds of those that have doubts about me and about where I'm coming from and who I am, and I will show that in the coming months and years.
Chief, thank you so much. We want to thank all of our panelists for providing their insights tonight. And we want to thank you for joining us for this special forum as part of Reforming the Force. Have a good night.